Thank you, Ruby, and thank you, Bharati, for that very generous, if unorthodox introduction. It is a privilege, really, to virtually share the screen with Pratima Doshiji, with Mr. Sitaram Kunde, Mr. Ajit Nimbalkar, Mr. Abhishek Krishna, and Hemal, and the trustees and distinguished guests who are here today. And it's an honor to speak today as we remember an exceptional human being and celebrate a life so meaningfully and intensively lived. I bring neither the credentials nor the gravitas of the luminaries who have spoken here before me. I'm here thanks to two very biased friends, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar and Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who very kindly persuaded Mr. Bharat Doshi to invite me. I draw courage from the fact that Lalit Doshi, given his passion for equity, would have approved of admitting women into this exclusive club. I have only quite recently made his acquaintance. He revealed himself through the rich tributes of professional colleagues and friends at his untimely demise, the expressions of deep affection and respect of his classmates, as Mr. Namgulkar has said today, for the brilliance that he demonstrated both in the classroom and in co-curriculars, the adulation of a sibling for the strength, fortitude, courage, and dignity he demonstrated when, through his college years, he provided anchor to the family through its financial struggles and remained the beacon of integrity and authenticity. And from the outpourings of deep gratitude of the many ordinary citizens whose lives he touched in quiet but profound ways. But what stood out for me was a letter that the principal of St. Xavier's College wrote about Lalit Doshi, extolling his qualities of head and heart and his exemplary, almost unmatched contribution to the college. Through this kaleidoscope, the Lalit Doshi that spoke to me was a person who consistently embraced what is called simple abundance, a disposition of mind that refused to be imprisoned by scarcity thinking, that engaged not with limits, but with possibilities. His low-key stewardship in spaces that formulated policy was so reminiscent of the Tao of leadership that Ambassador Vijay Nambiar knows very well. What is soft is strong. Like water, it can wear down through its fluidity and flow the most stubborn of rocks. And of course, for his very rare sensibility that was touched as much by the pain on our planet as the beauty of a bud unfolding. These values resonate deeply for us in the higher education space. And for me, the imagination of the Expansive Academy is captured in the Upanishadic aphorism, Sa Vidya Ya Vimuktaye. That alone is knowledge that leads to liberation. But whether Indian higher education has lived up to this expansive vision is a question we must continuously ask ourselves. Does our education aim to free our learners from the shackles of prejudice, ignorance, and hubris, and set them on the path of self-discovery? Does it encourage them to see the linkages between the local and the global, yatha pinde tatha brahmande, and reveal how every considered choice that we make has the potential to impact so many worlds? And to become socially engaged citizens, does it seek to cultivate a genuine recognition of the interconnectedness of all peoples and to facilitate cultures of peace, both within the academy and outside? And can it craft an affirmative discourse that makes despair unconvincing and hope practical? To harness the potential of all learners I do believe that our institutional arrangements for education must provide for at least 7 important avenues. You know, like Stephen Covey used to always talk about the 7 attributes for successful people. But here it's different. It's to provide for ruminative and aspirational spaces, dialogic spaces, inclusive and collaborative spaces, democratic spaces, spaces to envision a borderless world, and now, with the devastating impact of COVID, also healing spaces. And most importantly for me, engendered spaces. I will speak to some of these concerns. In the 7.5 decades of independence, the higher education system has grown exponentially in quantitative terms. It is second only to China in terms of enrollment. We have 38.5 million people enrolled in the higher education space. And it has the largest number of universities. Unbelievable, true. After which USA is second and China is third. The gross enrollment ratio, however, is still at 27.1. China is 54.5 and USA 85.8 in 2015. The national education policy that Mr. Kunde referred to aspires to move the GER to at least 50% by 2035. And that is quite a challenge. The higher education landscape in India is an enormously heterogeneous, burgeoning space. And owing to government policies on equity and reservations, erstwhile excluded and marginalized groups have entered in large numbers. And while many recognize this as access, equity, and expansion, others see this so-called massification of higher education as impinging upon what they term as quality and excellence. Yet, this is undoubtedly the first port of call when newly enfranchised groups enter the world of civic and, in some senses, social consciousness. It is a space of aspiration, but equally of collision and sometimes collusion. And it carries with it the huge responsibility of testing India's success or otherwise to deal with its teeming diversity. It is perhaps the most diverse and complex of spaces, a multiplicity of forms and formulations and articulations. So ranging from central to state to private and deemed universities and autonomous and constituent and affiliating colleges, specialized professional institutes of all hues, medicine, engineering, law, and so on, rural and tribal colleges and universities, women's only institutes, single discipline and multidisciplinary institutes, and minority institutes. The numbers are equally mind-boggling. 1,043 recognized universities, 42,343 colleges, 11,779 standalone institutions, and over 15 lakh teachers. Its sheer scale and heterogeneity truly defies quick fix formulas for reform. A complex and variegated ecosystem confronting what Devesh Kapoor has called the trilemma of scale, cost, and quality. And does India have the luxury to recreate the Western experience of brick and mortar universities? It's a question we must ask ourselves. With nearly 1 million Indians projected to enter the working age each month for the next 2 decades. Clearly not standardization, but a creative deployment of pluralism is what the academy in India needs today. An expansive academy is best nurtured by what Amartya Sen has called capacious heterodoxy. And this was indeed the vision of those who laid the philosophical foundations of education for a free India. And to invoke 3 of them, Tagore, Gandhi, and Nehru, who despite fundamental differences understood or underscored in unison the spirit of what later came to be called composite culture, which remained at root the celebration of diversity. And embedded in this is the vision of a space where diverse disciplines are on offer and diverse frameworks in each discipline, where students from diverse backgrounds find opportunity for nurture and growth and discovery, and where faculty from across regions and social groups are drawn with both public and private funding, and where the multiple intelligences that Professor Howard Gardner has spoken about can find hospitable expression. After all, as Ram Guha reminds us, Shanti Niketan, Tagore's Shanti Niketan, was the most powerful and profound metaphor against parochialism and the colonial hierarchies of knowledge systems, and of course, of the monocultures of the mind. In this tradition was embedded public reasoning and intellectual space to dispassionately and fearlessly address political choices and ethics in the public domain. Today, we need to ask ourselves whether these aspirations have succumbed at the altar of standardization and regulation. So we need to reclaim spaces that are open to the not always harmonious reverberations of learning. After all, the higher education space has been accused of being over-regulated and under-governed. So to impose a sterile uniformity where much richer ambiguities exist is to stop learning. Learning is, as we all know, where the liberals have it out with the conservatives, the Freudians with the unions, the Gandhians with the Marxists, the growth crusaders, as Professor Rakesh Mohan will tell us, with the environmentalists, and of late, of course, the feminists with everybody else. The idea of the academy as transformative, progressive, liberating space was written in some senses at inception into the DNA of universities in the Indian context. The other revolution of 1857, not the Indian War of Independence, but the other revolution was when the universities of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta were set up, although several colleges had preceded them from 1817 onwards. And they paradoxically, these universities were to later become incubators of the national movement and nurture a whole generation of outstanding freedom fighters. Many of the challenges that confront the academy as an expansive space correspond to legacy issues of the nation in the making following independence. Others are newer ones and have acquired salience given 21st century realities. So today, the domain of higher education as a possible liberatory force faces challenges from the threat to secular frameworks, from fundamentalisms of all kinds, from the dislocating and bewildering pace of change imposed by some aspects of globalization and neoliberal agenda, the digital disruptions that we have seen in this century particularly, and issues of legitimacy emerging from political interference and market compulsions, uninspiring leadership, and corrupt and inept government practices, but above all, confusion about the idea of the university itself. So the NEP 2020, or the NEP, has provided us a context to revisit and refocus, not just on the hardware issues, not just on teacher training, examination reform, and so on, but on the software, the perspectives, the predispositions, the mindsets that are needed to craft the imagination of the academy. So we need new lenses, there is no doubt about it, to balance old age concerns of equity, access, and quality. We need to wrest it out of the limiting politics of quota and restrictive identity politics and embed it squarely within positive affirmative action that expands respect and human dignity. There is need to continually interrogate the gatekeeping mechanisms in higher education. We need new lenses again to interrogate how the notions of merit itself have been configured in the public discourse. Merit, unfortunately today, is being conflated with marks received in disparate board examinations. This merit ranking as the only criteria for induction into the higher education space obscures really the causal contribution of pervasive cultural and socioeconomic preconditions of inequalities that block a level playing field and consequently access to higher education. Only recently, a remark from a young student who has recently joined college came as a shocker to me. And she said, you know what? We've begun to see ourselves as extensions of our mark sheet. And that is very telling about what higher education and the merit-only criteria has done to our ways of thinking. Equity and access are also about acceptance, as the poignant cases of a Rohit Vemula or a Payal Tadvi demonstrate, and more recently, the resignation of the IIT professor in Chennai, Vipin Vitu, who spoke about casteism and ableism on our campuses. We need new lenses to see how epistemic injustice occurs when particular kinds of knowledge systems are privileged and others are unvalued or simply invisibilized. We women know only too well, for example, how history has erased her story. Local knowledges, tribal knowledges are obscured in view, especially in the post-colonial arrangements. The teaching of history itself has become a contested terrain, deeply implicated in ideological battles. Texts that are prescribed or proscribed, monochromatic textbooks as canon, which scholars would be invited or uninvited to speak at convocations, and the liberal arts and social sciences taking a backseat in the imagination of the university in an overarching tendency to merely valorize science and technical education. And a truly liberal education will demand then what Shiv Vishwanathan has said, for us to recognize that the laboratory is no longer the only center of the universe of innovation. The iconography of science needs to be tempered by the iconoclasm of craft, of indigenous systems, of medicine, of knowledge, and doing away with the silos between the formal economy, the scientific sector, and the informal words of alternative techniques of craft societies, livelihoods that are often constructed as lesser worlds. So there is a huge area that the new expansive academy needs to traverse. The 75th year of our independence is also an opportune moment to invoke the democratic responsibilities and credentials of the academy. Universities, as we all know, are not merely transactional hubs of learning and teaching. As social institutions, they anticipate a new reality, envision alternatives, and establish the terms of civilized engagement in democratic citizenship. Embedded in the very idea of the university, as David Kerb says, are values that the market alone does not honor. The belief in a community of scholars and not a confederacy of self-seekers, in the idea of openness and not ownership, in the professor as a pursuer of truth and not an entrepreneur, in the student as acolyte and not as consumer, end quote. So diverse imaginations of the university inform contemporary discourse. So we are all familiar with the idea of the Newman University, the Humboldtian ideal, the entrepreneurial model, and more recently, a very exciting idea of the radical edufactory, of a virtual autonomous global intellectual commons. The university today is really a fluid daily plebiscite contingent on how it navigates an array of tensions, such as between academic freedom and organizational responsibilities, and accountability, between its connection with the state and centers of power, between teaching as the transmission of critical attitudes and society's expectations on qualifications for employability. Mr. Kunte referred to that in his speech, between contributing to the economy and providing a space for which is free from utilitarian pressures. And yet, how far must the academy insulate itself from the socio-political milieu in which it is embedded? Fortunately, the solipsistic notion of the ivory tower has given way to the idea of the engaged university, linking town and gown. Then NEP2 steadfastly underscores outreach programs, highlighting the social responsibility of the university. And so what does it mean? Does it exhort learners to move beyond the safe provision of personal and material gratification and to throw themselves into the heat and dust of subaltern aspirations with the intention of making their voice count? Does this then not imply greater permeability between the roles of the teacher and the public intellectual to bestir the quiet voice of ethically engaged freedom for the public good? And in an age of ceaseless technological change, the need for historical, philosophical perspectives and the ability to demonstrate, as Pratap Mehta has said, that a politics that rises above resentment and that is without enemies is possible. And also the need to acknowledge the wisdom of those who may march to the beat of a different drum. For a variety of reasons, universities have abdicated their roles as sites of the dissenting tradition. History is replete with examples of the possibilities of the so-called heretical interrogations, opening new continents of thoughts. So the contributions of an Aryabhatta or a Buddha, Hypatia of Alexandria, that amazing woman who was burnt at the stake for her ideas, Khwarizmi, Copernicus, Galileo, Al-Zahiri, Descartes, Newton, Marx, Einstein, you name it. They were all built on paradigm shifts that disrupted settled comfort zones. And the oft-invoked Nalanda tradition itself too excelled in pushing the sutras to evoke new voices through reasoned dialogue and debate. So as classrooms evolve from safe to brave spaces, teaching to transgress becomes integral to pedagogy. Analysis of the structures of dominance and power and prejudice that compound exclusions and silences in knowledge production become vital. And I want to underscore this. The depoliticized classroom is an oxymoron today. More so, as critical thinking increasingly becomes the accepted imprimatur of academic credentials. Even the net talks about critical thinking all the time. After all, Socrates' chosen path was really to shake people out of their complacency and thoughtlessness and to put their own certitudes to scrutiny, not to offer an unproblematic map to navigate their worlds. So while it is important to comfort the afflicted, it is sometimes important also to afflict the comfortable, especially when they are comfortably, contentedly wrong. And so it is in what scholar Ashok Bajpai calls the unceasing, unstoppable, interminable satyagraha against simplification and totalization that the academy will really genuinely reflect Atmanirbharta. And in blending precept and practice as thinkers and practitioners, the educators of dissent who waged conflict non-violently in recent history, from Gandhi to Ambedkar to Martin Luther King, Václav Havel even, and even the young protagonists of the student movement in France in 1968, represent this impulse. But it's found its most eloquent articulation in the Brazilian philosopher of education, Paulo Freire, who in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1968, extolled the need for critical pedagogy as a project of dissent and a struggle for justice and democracy, a mission to recreate the world constantly, namely a political pedia. We are all familiar with the astonishing speed with which the line between dissent and sedition gets thinner by the day, as perspectives become monochromatic in majoritarian populist discourse. And the frazzled link between the functioning of our universities and the quality and future of our democracy needs urgently to be restored. Very much like the Proustian wisdoms, which says that true voyage of discovery really lies not in seeking new landscapes, but having new eyes. So what of the academy as an engendered space, which is really today the burden of my song? An oft quoted mantra or repeated mantra among the cognoscenti about India is that social and economic costs of endemic gender-based exclusion and violence is staggering. Equally, that the discrimination that girls and women in the country face in terms of access to not just education, but denial of equal property rights, access to livelihood opportunities, and inadequate participation in the public sphere, all coalesce to undermine what we call national capital. Yet how widely acknowledged or accepted is this perspective? The iconic Justice J.S. Verma Committee report, which incidentally contains a remarkable Bill of Rights described as a Magna Carta for women in South Asia, following the the infamous Nirbhaya incident in 2012, highlighting the role of education as critical for gender justice in India, provided a scathing critique of areas in which education has fallen short in reversing gender stereotypes. His report, of course, created history, and now there is no looking back on its exhortations. It culminated, as we all know, in the path-breaking legislation against sexual harassment at the workplace. At one level, a quiet revolution has been taking place in institutions of higher education in recent years, with the unprecedented rates of growth in enrollment from social groups that up until 2 decades ago were effectively marginalized and excluded from higher education, and women form a major part of this. And what these numbers are really telling us is that the much cited demographic dividend is placing its faith in higher education more than ever before in India's history. Huge aspirations are being incubated and aspirations for change in the higher education space in India today. So women with an enrollment of 18.3 million today constitute 49% of all students in higher education in India today. But at the same time, this closing gender gap hides ongoing inequalities and disparities among women and men, which can only be gauged with an intersectional analysis that combines gender with region, class, caste, religion, among others. For example, if you are a Dalit, tribal, and a woman from a backward region also, and you happen to be differently able, you can imagine the odds that are stacked against you. So an intersectional analysis is crucial. Interestingly, the hiring of female faculty has also substantially increased from 37.8% in 2010-11 to 42.2%. This is more than in any other formal sector of employment. And despite this impressive numeric increase, the absence of robust gender-just practices deprive women, or continue to deprive women, of substantive equality and voice in the higher education space. In recent years, it might interest you to know, a spate of student protests across campuses in India have highlighted the pervasiveness of gender discriminatory practices and cultures of impunity and cultures of silence around GBV, gender-based violence, in the higher education space, which is meant to be transformatory and which upholds the constitutional ideals of equality. And they have brought to light several retrograde practices. And can you imagine what these are? These are discriminatory evaluation as a means to domesticate vocal students who protest, differential timings for access to libraries and student hostels that disadvantage women, imposition of dress codes, inhibiting the mobility of female students by designating areas as unsafe for women in and around campuses, infantilizing women, intrusion into the privacy of women students through surveillance and monitoring in the garb of protection, and also sending disciplines like gender studies to the basement of the building. The vulnerability to discrimination and violence is, of course, exponentially increased if you belong to marginalized communities or religious or sexual minorities, and or the differently abled, as I mentioned earlier. So the Pinjra Tod agitation across northern and central India have been a reaction to this. So the question is, how can purely legal remedies like the prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace apply to universities and colleges that are not, and they're not workplaces in the conventional sense, where we don't need retributive justice, but restorative justice, not punitive measures alone, but transformatory processes that need to be invoked. Now, female faculty have also had to combat glass ceilings. The ratio of female professors to male professors in 2019 was 37 for every 100. And in 2015, can you believe it, there were only 3% of women vice chancellors in this vast country with over 1,000 universities. And out of these, 18 were already women-only universities. Today, their number stands at 16 vice chancellors in this vast country of opportunity. Despite the STEM fields appearing as very neutral and objective from the outside, there also exists high incidence of harassment and discrimination in science departments on campuses, where generous research grants are available, with the laboratory, with the lab often as a site where this is played out in manifold ways, like hostile working environment or quid pro quo harassment. So organizational structure, student services, infrastructure, and communication strategies all need to be re-envisioned and engendered. Because a policy focus solely on gender parity in enrollment or even in hiring hides these covert but real forms of discrimination that leave out women, that deprive women of voice and agency. Now, gender audits have only recently entered the lexicon of the higher education space. But as part of social audits, they are an invaluable participatory tool to enhance gender justice, because they assist HEIs in turning the searchlight inwards to internally disrupt practices that perpetuate patriarchal gender relations. In our own experience of conducting GAs, we found that they provided an excellent medium for collective introspection. We had the good fortune to work with some of your colleagues from St. Xavier's, and I would like to particularly mention the Vice Principal Rishikesh Samant and his 3 senior colleagues who actively participated in this. And it would be worthwhile to get their feedback on whether they felt that it was a truly transformatory experience or not. The groundbreaking Saksham report of 2013 was a shocker. It was a moment of reckoning for the academy. It was tasked by the UGC to recommend gender sensitization measures for campuses. And it was based on a large number of Jan Sunwais at HEIs across the country. And it made scathing observations about systemic violence, gendered practices, widespread misogyny and patriarchal norms and hierarchies prevalent on campuses. Even the mandated Vishakha guidelines of 79 were being flouted. And especially women and minorities were deprived of basic infrastructure like toilets and lighting, and redressal mechanisms were woefully inadequate or not even existent in many of the higher education institutes. And it's also interesting, Ambassador Nambiar would be interested to know this, that the Samagati report of 2014 surprisingly reconfirmed the prevalence of these practices even in the highly literate state of Kerala, which has such positive human development indicators. And offline, I'm happy to share with you horror stories from that very literate state. So Maya Angelou's refrain, I do not want to just survive, but I want to thrive. And I want to do so with passion, with compassion, and some humor and some style, resonates deeply for us when we recall the checkered history of women's entry into the higher education space in India. It is significant that the famous royal rescript of 1817, it was really the Queen Regent Gauri Parvati Bai of Travancore who articulated what was perhaps the first formal recognition of the state's responsibility to ensure the right to education to its people. And we are all very familiar with the valiant struggles, the personal trials and tribulations, and the hard-won professional triumphs of the pioneering women, many of them from the state of Maharashtra of the 19th and 20th century in India, who breached male bastions of educational privilege. Pioneers like Pandita Ramabai, Anandibai Joshi, Savitribai Phule, Fatima Sheikh, and Sister Nivedita, although not from Maharashtra, ventured undaunted in a conservative, paternalistic society. And the legions of women that followed in national and international fora, from the 15 women members of our Constituent Assembly. And I challenge you, many of you will not even know their names. Their names are seldom heard. And it included a Dalit woman, Dakshayani Velayudan, and they blazed an impressive trail. Hansa Mehta, who got the UN Declaration of Human Rights rescripted to include all human beings and not just men in 1948, was a shining example. So women's colleges, now women's colleges starting from the Venerable Bethune College in Calcutta in 1879, on to, of course, the SNDT, the first women's university, on to Indraprastha College, and there were very many in between in 1924, were the crucible for access to higher education of quality for women pre-independence. And although the nationalist movement spurred by Gandhiji brought unprecedented numbers of women into the public sphere, their rights to education, interestingly, largely remained couched within the discourse of making better homes, better families, and better society, and running homes in an orderly and aesthetic fashion. The emancipation of women was posited largely as the concern and project of progressive and reformist men. But it was not until the iconic Towards Equality report of 1974, which was a precursor of sorts to the National Policy on Education of 1986, that the discourse on women's education significantly changed. And it focused on the specific needs of those who have been denied equality, and it carried an exhortation to see women not just as the objects of history, but the subjects of their own histories, nudging the discourse away from victimhood to agency. Today, of course, we are witness to the grit of a Devangana Kalita, a Natasha Narwal, a Disha Ravi, adding meaningful layers to the palimpsests of their courageous foremothers. Women are the world's greatest underutilized resource, and education is key to unlocking that potential. We all are aware of that. And through the pandemic, the world watched with much admiration how women heads of state in countries like New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, the Nordic countries proactively responded to the pandemic and spoke in a different voice, a different language of empathetic leadership. The pandemic has also revealed the indispensable role of women as frontline corona warriors or healers, foregrounding the ethics of care, which we need a lot of today in the academy. So whether you subscribe to the idea that the 21st century is the century for women or not, I happen to believe that. It is important to say that in the age of Anthropocene, the notes on collaboration and interconnectedness that women tend to effortlessly bring to their workspaces could become the medium of learning in the academy that truly captures the real essence of Samgachatvam, Samgavatvam. The engendering space of the academy, I would like to share, friends, is not a feminized ghetto. To my understanding, it is a space where women script and play a visible role in rescripting priorities and offering a new conceptual vocabulary for social change for both men and women. It is a space that challenges ethnocentric, anthropocentric, and androcentric constructions of knowledge. It expands inclusion. It offers antidotes to toxic masculinities or notions of muscular leadership in the use of power. It seeks to give voice to the voiceless. It creates truly dialogic cultures of active listening, samvad over vivad, and counter the crisis of civility that affects public institutions today. It carries an ecological sensibility that envisions this fragile planet as a paradigm of humanity. It nurtures global citizens who internalize truly the true spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It frames what is referred to as internationalization of higher education beyond the signing of MOUs with foreign universities or a focus of international rankings or mere exchange programs. It does include that, or even as a vehicle for enhancing India's soft power. Incidentally, you would be interested to know that India exports 750,000 students to foreign universities and actually invites less than 50,000 universities into India today. That's a startling statistic. But an engendered space also includes these elements, but it envisions it more expansively. It involves at root transcending the cartographic anxieties of borders and boundaries, so familiar to security establishments. And it is being engaged in both receiving from and contributing to the intellectual global learning commons. This requires an acknowledgement that a global aspiration for an expansive footprint abroad does not sit well with a shrinking vision within. So an engendered academy, I'm sorry, Professor Mohan, economy slipped out of my mouth involuntarily. So an engendered academy will purpose its resources to reinforce cultures of peace, restore the fragile canvas of coexistence, combat prejudice, parochialism, and reappropriate disciplines like history and literature, for example, to celebrate diversity, to recognize difference, but to build on commonalities. While educating for good citizenship, it also builds links with people's movements that are reclaiming and voicing democracy and that interrogate the abuse of power or paradigms of development that disenfranchise groups. Very little of their experience enters the classroom space today. And it is not a coincidence that since the 1990s, many of these movements have been led by women. So whether it is the Right to Information campaign, the Bhopal Gas Pirit Andolan, the Balyapal protest, the Pudam Kalam, or even earlier the Chipko. I don't know if I should mention Shaheen Bagh, but I will anyway. So women's institutes of higher learning have been radically impactful in generating what is known as social capital propelling them as change agents in the larger world that at times tends to undervalue them. Having spent most of my life in a women's college, I can say with reasonable certitude that contrary to some perceptions about single-sex colleges, especially women's colleges, they are not ghettoized or cloistered or gendered spaces, which are quaintly out of date or out of touch with reality. In India, they constitute 10% of the total number of colleges, do exceedingly well in rankings, exceedingly well, are fairly well managed. So a women's college is not merely a room of its own, but it functions in many ways as an alternative civic sphere, infused with powerful traditions, norms, and values, sensitive to systemic exclusion and glass ceilings, and nurturing a liberating, not domesticating pedagogy, while preparing students to be worlds ready, futures ready, and even work ready. Its notions of leadership are an interrogation of top-down exercise of power. So in sum, the Engendered Academy rewrites its script in what the intrepid author Ursula Le Guin described as the metaphoric mother tongue, the language of dialogue, of empathy, of inclusion, not just Malayalam, Hindi, Urdu, or Bengali, the language in which meaningful conversations unfold, the language often silenced, but always on the verge of song, the language not of the conqueror, but the seeker, the language in which all maps can change, the language that can speak truth to power. So what is the academy we need? And I will sum up. I hope I haven't taken too much time. COVID-19 has shaken the landscape of higher education in tectonic ways. Established modes of functioning have come asunder. It is not just the shape or the size and the form of the classroom that has changed, but also what it's taught and how it is taught, hurtling this 37.4 million student population into bewilderment and anxiety about the future. But if crisis offers opportunities, this is the time to wrest the initiative and to break free of moribund drills and reimagine the academy. With education shifting from class to online, students with uneven access to knowledge and to technology, learning resources, internet connectivity, and lacking in suitable physical space are disproportionately affected. Women and students with special needs in particular, those from homes that are financially stressed or where higher education is not valued as a priority, those in dysfunctional family situations with additional caring responsibilities during the crisis face particular challenges. Access to online learning, friends, is far from equitable. We are all familiar with the poignant story of the young student from Orissa, from the hinterland in Orissa, who recently slipped to death from his hillock perch in search of connectivity. And that is only one of the many unseen casualties. The majority of students, however, and it is time now that we began to celebrate our teachers. Our teachers, the majority of teachers rose remarkably to the occasion, switching almost overnight from face-to-face teaching to the less satisfying yet daunting terrain of virtual education and acquiring new skills in the process. But educators missed out on the thrills of the shared everyday epiphanies in the proximate classroom space. The flicker of recognition, the acceptance of an idea, the quizzical articulations, and such unmediated communication always remains the authentic barometer of learning resonances, the ultimate spur of motivation. The collaborative, ruminative space of the academy seems to have shrunk into a screen. Students also missed out on the intensity of co-curricular endeavor, the allure of the sports field, the camaraderie of cultural engagement, the life-changing interactions in hostels, the friendly sparring that Lalit Doshi so enjoyed of dialogue and debate, the discovery of unfamiliar worlds, new calibrations of identity, of autonomy, freedom, and not last but not least, the tangible lessons of citizenship, of bargaining, and of coexistence. So current structures are attempting to prepare students for futures that we cannot even predict or imagine. So the ability to constantly learn and relearn will consequently be key to navigate the maze of the future. Daniel Pink actually had said that the future belongs to the right brainers of the world, pattern recognizers, meaning makers, empathizers. But whether we believe it or not, this moment might ironically be the opening in the academy for teachers and students to become better co-learners, partners in knowledge production, for teachers to revisit their pedagogy, providing greater room to engage in a constructivist classroom, for administrators to develop more deft and equitous internal mechanisms to meet contingencies, and for young learners to acquire the mental and emotional skills and resilience. Resilience is very important to deal with the disruptions and the discontinuities that will likely define the century. So the pandemic has highlighted the need for teachers to be sensitive to the intersectionalities of vulnerability, to know that every student may have a different need, a universe of possibilities and challenges that are unique to her, to infuse the classroom space with the ethics and pedagogies of care that are also cognizant of the immediacy of crises, new ways to discuss and teach how reaching out in crisis, in support, in the midst of a rapidly changing learning space is also integral to higher education. The NSS report of 2018 throws light on the starkness of new exclusions. Only 9% households have digital infrastructure. 21% of that are in urban areas and 4% in rural. So when we talk about digitization as the alternative, we have to think this through very carefully. And are we adequately focused on putting together the foundations of the empathic, healing space where our future efforts must really lie? A new non-hierarchical horizon of a Guru Shishya Parampara beckons us today. In the spring of 1993, and I'm coming to the end of this, the students of my college, Lady Shri College, had organized a seminar on undergraduate education. And below the logo of the pamphlet was this exhortation from T.S. Eliot. And it said, and I quote, "Where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge that we've lost in information?" 28 years later, this rings truer than ever before. It's compelling. And I was thinking how Lalit Doshi might have responded to this. And another piece from Eliot came to mind. And I quote, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know it for the first time. Know ourselves for the first time." Lalit Doshi would have valued the audacity of hope, agreed that no pessimist ever discovered the secret of the stars or opened a new doorway to the human spirit, and that the purpose of all education, all art, and alternatively all knowledge is to lead us to hitherto unexplored realms of self-discovery. Thank you for your patience.